Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the third video in the chapter of videos where we look at installing IXP Manager for the first time and getting it set up. What we're going to look at in this particular video is, now that we've installed IXP Manager, we're going to look at what the first steps are to get it ready to start adding members to your exchange, managing ports and IP addresses and things like that. So there's some data fill we need to do to get to the first stage. One thing I'm going to gloss over in this is configuring email, which is actually something that comes up from time to time on the mailing list. For now, just look at the mailing list archives. We have a little bit of work to do just to make this easier and to document it a bit better rather than relying on Laravel, which is the PHP framework we use. So rather than relying on their documentation, we need to make it a little bit easier as part of the installation script and as part of our own documentation. So we might do a different video on that, and we need to add some kind of test tools, IXP Manager as well, so you can test email a bit easier than how it's done currently. So what we're going to do today again is that very first step where we've installed IXP Manager, what next? So when you installed IXP Manager through the videos that we've already done, or just the documentation yourself, what you will have done is you will have followed on docs.ixpmanager.org, our documentation website, you'll have followed either the automated install script, which will link you to the post install, or you will have done the manual installation, which will also link you to the post install. And both of those links bring you to this post install steps page here, as it exists in April 2020. So essential step to set up your IXP. And there's really 6 steps, and we're going to cover each of those 6 steps here today. So let's look at our install. So this is kind of where we left it. I can't remember if we used this or not, but this is essentially a fresh installation using the automated install script, just using the default values. So, and I set a username called IXP Manager, and I set a password. So when I log in, I have this exactly as we saw it after those installation steps. And what we need to do now is do these first steps post install. So if you look at this menu on the left, and we often refer to this as the left-hand side menu or the LHS menu, you'll see it's broken into a couple of sections. IXP member actions. So they're things that we're not going to look at today, and they're member-specific tasks. What we are going to look at is some of the IXP admin actions. We're not going to look at IXP statistics, and then at the bottom we have some utilities. Utilities, I mean, as an example of utility, we've got PHP info. And this is the standard PHP info response. And sometimes if you're on the mailing list and you ask for help, we may ask you for a little bit of information off this so that we can understand your operating system and your environment and what kind of parameters you've set on your PHP server. But today we're going to start with number 1. And number 1 is going to be creating your infrastructure. And an infrastructure in IXP Manager is essentially your IXP. You may just have one, and most small IXs only have one. INEX has 3, just to give you some background. We have INEX LAN 1 and INEX LAN 2 in Dublin. INEX LAN 2 has existed for about 10 years, and that's because our members asked us, as INEX grew in importance to them, to create a second infrastructure so that there were essentially 2 internet exchanges for Ireland. So that's INEX LAN 1, where nearly everybody connects to. In fact, all of our members connect to INEX LAN 1 as the primary peering LAN. We have INEX LAN 2, which is a secondary or resilient peering LAN, where about 70% of our members connect. We have a third exchange called INEX Cork, which is down in the south of the country, and that's very much a regional exchange with just a handful of members that just peer traffic locally. And it's something that we're trying to start off and trying to build traffic and build members and build importance and relevance down in the south of the country. So that is for INEX, where we have 3 infrastructures, and that's like 3 different IXPs. An infrastructure will gather switches together that won't cross boundaries. So all the switches on one infrastructure would never have traffic for a different infrastructure. We'll see that, how we connect these things as we start adding this information to IXP Manager. So when you've installed IXP Manager using the installation script, and also I think with the manual installation process as well with some of the data fill, you'll have this default infrastructure run 1 already set up for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to edit that because there's some key pieces of information that you need in here. And just actually, as we look at this page, actually, just to give you a bit of a layout of what's going on here, this is quite typical of our administrative interfaces. You've got a title up in the top left that tells you what you're looking at. You've got a database, or a table at least, that represents the database entries. We'll often show you the database ID, and this is kind of needed sometimes for API endpoints and things like that. It's essentially the primary key of this record in the database. With some information that we're showing you or exposing you in the table itself. We always have a view option, which gives you all of the database entries, more than you might get in the table. We have an edit option, a delete option, and then sometimes you might find that there's more options when you click on this. So you can see specifically with an infrastructure that it's giving you an ability to view or filter the switches on that infrastructure, the VLANs that exist, and then the public and private VLANs that exist on that infrastructure. What you'll always find in these pages is the add is up in the top right. So that would be if we wanted to add in new infrastructure. We don't want to do that right now. What I want to do actually is edit the one that we have, just to complete the data fill that we would have put in as part of the installation of IXP Manager. So to try and base this in reality, I'm going to do this as if it was INX. So we're going to go with INX LAN 1 here. The short name #1 is absolutely fine. I'm not really sure that we actually use it anywhere at the moment. It's important to set the country because when you export information through the IXF member export schema, and again, just to show you, if you want to read more about that, under features on the documentation, you're going to find the IXF member export, and that's an agreed and standardized JSON schema which allows IXPs to make their member list available for consumption by tools such as PeeringDB, your own members with their own automated provisioning tools, and all other kinds of data consumers that might exist out there. It is enabled by default, and it's publicly accessible by default because as exchanges, as IXPs, we tend to be generally very open about what we do. If you want to make it private, there's some information in here as well about how to do that. So this will be the primary infrastructure, which is basically just a default peering LAN. If you only have one, that's the one you want to tick. If you've got more than one, it's really going to be, for example, for INX LAN 1. It wouldn't be LAN 2 or Cork, for example. So now, when you loaded this page, IXP Manager pulled some information live from the IXF database. And this is where we need to find our exchange in the IXF database. And also for PeeringDB, which we exist there too. Again, one thing you'll find in anytime you're adding or editing a record is we've got this green context help option. And that will give you more information about what's expected in each field. So for example, for the country is shown in the IXF member export that we just talked about for the IXP. For IXPs that span more than one country, this should represent the head office or administrative location. Specific city and country locations will come as part of the switch export later when we set up facilities, and we'll see that. Your IXF database ID. So identify your IXP from the IIX Federation's database, and if it doesn't exist, we tell you that you should contact the UIX Secretariat to get that information in there. So we're going to save that, and that's our infrastructure up to date now for what our exchange, what we want our exchange to be. I might just take a sideline here because we've spoken a little bit about the IXF export in doing that. So let's just have a look at API keys. And these are API keys that relate to my own user. I can create a key by just adding it here. I can give it a description. I don't have to. And again, you can get help on that. I can give it an expiry date as well if I want to. So I've created an API key, and that's what it looks like. They're hidden by default. So if I come back to this page again later, I can't see it. I just have to put in my password, and it's going to show me my API keys where I can edit them and delete them here as well. In terms of endpoints, the reason I came in here is I wanted to show you the IXF member export endpoint, which we have listed down here in available API endpoints. So I'm going to click on that, and I'm just going to show you the text version of it so you can see it's just pure JSON. My browser has a plugin that highlights it, which makes it easier to read. So you can see it's version 1 when we exported this. Some information about my IXP. And as we move down, we can see that we have got no VLANs, no switches, and no members. We're going to see as we start adding data fill how that builds out. So we've done our infrastructures. The next thing we need to do, and again, what I'm doing is I'm working off of this post-install step list. So I've done step 1. I now need to add a facility, which is a point of presence, a POP, or a location. So someplace where you're going to have a rack which stores your switches. So again, I'm going to go back to my IXP admin actions, and down here I will find facilities. If you're looking for this in the database, it's called location. It's the old name. We switched to PeeringDB's nomenclature, so facilities and racks, rather than locations and cabinets as we used to have in older versions of IXP Manager. So not unsurprisingly, no facility exists, and we have the option here to add one. And again, we can see that we've got some context help here, just explaining what a facility is. So we're going to add one here. We're going to give it a name. Again, let's try and root this in something real. So we're going to give it interaction.1. We'd often refer to that as IX.1. A tag is kind of something that we use when we're naming switches, and we, if we're naming a switch, we might do like SW I1 for infrastructure 1. You might give it a location, so you might be inclined to put IX.1 here or IX1 for interaction. We found over time that data centers tend to undergo mergers and acquisitions every few years, and this becomes a real pain when we name switches by their data center name. So what we've tended to start doing is naming them by their physical location. So interaction.1 is in a estate in Dublin called Park West. So we call this PWT for Park West. Park West actually has more than one co-location facility for us. So interaction.1 is actually Park West 1. And then we might do 1 for the first switch in that location. So infrastructure 1, so the infrastructure, the location, and then a numbered switch. So the tag here would be PWT1 in that example. Again, IXP Manager went off and did an API request from PeeringDB to get a list of all of the PeeringDB facilities. And we should find in here interaction dub1. And it looks like for some reason, so these facilities, dub1 and dub2, are very close to each other, about 400 meters away from each other. And they've got a lot of campus connectivity between them. So that may be why that they've named or grouped these together on PeeringDB. The city is what's going to show up in your IXF export, and that's required here, and so is country required. Everything else is optional, and it's really where you want to put information about how you interact with these facilities. So you might put NOC and office details. In notes, you might put URL for their administrative portal, for example. One thing in notes is that usually when they're displayed in views and stuff, we interpret them as markdown. So you could put in this is, and a markdown, a double asterisk would be bold. This is markdown, and a backtick would be inline code. So we could put that in. And if you want to get a preview of this as you do it, you can just click preview, and it's going to go back and do a quick API request to turn that into markdown, so you can see what it looks like. So we're going to add that facility, and there it is. That's great. This shouldn't make any difference to our export here, because in our export we don't actually show facilities. We're going to show switches, and so it's going to come up later for switches. So that was step 2. So now we've added a facility. Step 3 is adding racks. So we need to add a rack to the facility so that we can later add a switch into that rack. So there was facilities. If we move down, here's our racks. So a rack or a cabinet. So we can call this anything we like. PWT11 is what we're going to go with here. The facility is what we've just added. So there's interaction.1, and that came straight from the facility that we added here. Colocation ref, these are normally named in interaction something like country, facility, room, row cab. So whatever's appropriate. Height, we say it's 42U, or sorry, type. Type, again, you might say, what do they want you to put here? What's the relevance? So again, you can hit help, and what you'll find out, this is actually free text. You can do anything you like with it. Height's going to be 42U, kind of standard rack. And Unused typically count from the bottom on most racks where they're numbered. Sometimes they count from the top. It's important, just if you have to give remote hands instructions and the user labeled on the rack, you might just want to remind yourself how they're numbered. And we're going to add that. So there's our rack added. Back to post-install steps. What's step 4? So now we can add switches. And we do have good documentation. So under our documentation, we've got installation, we've got general usage. And under general usage, we've got switches. Just opening a new tab. And we've got some screenshots here trying to explain how to add and edit switches and what's important about platform discovery, port types, automated polling and how that works. Migrating customers to a new switch, related tools. So, a lot of information and documentation that you really should take the time to read. For now, we're just going to barrel through here and we're going to add a switch ourselves. So the IXP Manager I'm using is version 5.5, but it's actually 5.6 in development. And when I was in a run through of this, I found that when I went to add one, this actually brought me to add. And this is adding a switch manually, which is something we really want to avoid. So if you're using IXP Manager 5.5 or lower, and you go to switches and you click add one, that's going to bring you to the wrong place. The add up here in the top right will actually bring you to the right place, and that's going to be fixed from 5.6 onwards. And the right place is add a switch via SNMP. So we want to discover the switch using SNMP, and discover all of the ports and do all the kind of heavy lifting that you need that's needed for IXP Manager. So I've created a dummy switch. I'm just using a SNMP replay daemon just to get this working. It's a dump of a switch I took at INX about 2 years ago. It's an Arista, if memory serves. We find out here pretty quickly. So there we are. It's an Arista, a DCS 7280 SR. So it's got 48 10 gig ports and 600 gig ports. So I've got my name for my switch. And again, if you remember, like in INX, I was suggesting that we would do it something like switch with infrastructure 1, 2, or Cork is how we actually name it. So infrastructure 1. This switch is in Park West 1, and it's the first switch there. And our host name would normally match that. It's going to be in this rack. Picking the rack obviously picks the location, the data center co-location, the facility, because that rack exists in a particular facility. And the infrastructure. So it's going to be INX LAN 1. And that's the only information I need to give to add a switch right now. There is information here about management configuration and layer 3 configuration. We're going to come back to all of that later. Again, there's loads of information in the context help. This is really around, that information is really required when we go into automated provisioning of switches, maybe way down the road in these video tutorials. So we're going to start with just adding that switch with the basic information. And you can see here, I've got all that information in my table. I can view that switch, which again gives me all the information that's in the database. Let's start at the top. Another thing that you will notice that isn't there for facilities and racks, because they're fairly easy things to understand with the built-in help. Switches is much more complex. And where we have documentation online, at the time of the version of IXP Manager that you're using, we will put a documentation link in there. And that will normally bring you off to a new tab or a new window with the actual documentation straight into docs.ixpmanager.org. So if you see that, you know that documentation exists, you can go and get more help. Show active only will only show you switches that are actually active, and that's all that's happening there. List mode default is what you see here, but we also can show you an OS view. And an OS view will give you the operating system that the switch is running, the operating system version, the serial number if it's available. And not implemented will either mean that it's not implemented by the vendor, by the switch itself, or by the SNMP polling tool that we're using, which is called OSS SNMP. It's a PHP library that we're using. It's one that I actually wrote myself about 10 years ago, which, while useful, if I had to write it today, it would be written very differently. But it's still functional, still using IXP Manager, and it does the job. When that switch was last polled as well. So we last polled that just now. I'm doing this on the 29th of April at just after midday local time. And that switch is active. We also have a layer 3 view. Again, that's not relevant now. That's some of that information that we didn't enter that we're not going to look at. So there's that information, that switch we just added. Let's see what that does to our IXF member export. Let's refresh this page here. So now where switches had been empty, we now have one switch, as we'd expect. The ID is basically the database ID, but that ID is going to be used later to reference member ports back to this switch. So it's really just an internal reference for this JSON object. The switch name, the colo facility by name, the city, the country. So that comes from the facility directly. So that switch exists in a rack in IXP Manager, which in turn exists in a facility, and that's where the city and country has come from. The PeeringDB facility ID also comes from that country. So now what we're going to look at here as well is some of the drop-down information that's available for our switches. So I can view and edit the ports. And you saw there in that drop-down that this is an SNMP action. That means that there's a live SNMP query happening at the background. Because I'm using this SNMP replay agent, it's actually really slow. But some switches are also really slow, so don't expect to get an instant response to that. What you're going to find here is a table listing the ports that have been auto-discovered by SNMP. The member, if we have linked this port to a member in IXP Manager, the port description is taken from SNMP, the alias, which is also taken from SNMP, whether that port is active or not, and that's active in IXP Manager rather than active on the switch, and then the type. So in terms of, status new means that we have just found this port through that SNMP poll. What we can do is we can bulk set some of these to, for example, peering. And the type will go through, but peering or unset unknown means that that port will appear in a drop-down list of available ports, ports that haven't been allocated otherwise when we're provisioning members later. We can also just do that very quickly here, just do it manually. You can see when this came back as well that we've lost all of these new statuses because these ports have already been found. This is a new page refresh and they already exist in the database, so they're not new. So we can go through all that with set all those ports to peering. Other port types that we have, if we go down to the bottom here, for our core ports, ports that connect switches together, we would set those to core. We normally have a port that we use to mirror traffic when we're provisioning a new member or diagnosing member issues. We put them into a quarantine VLAN, then we do a port mirror on that so we can see where an issue may exist. And that would be a monitor port. Fan out and reseller, or to do with reselling, exchange resellers. We're going to come back to that another time. Other is something that we haven't otherwise thought of. And then the management is for the actual management interface on the switch. So that was those. That was that drop down, which was our SNMP view edit ports. We can do a live port states. And again, this is another SNMP query. It's going to take a second. This is going to go off and find out what the live state of the ports are on the switch in real time. It's going to show us if the port is admin up or down and if it's operational. So the admin state on the switch is up for all of those ports. The operational state, not present, means that there's no SFP, SFP plus in the slot, or the port is up and active. So there's an SFP in the slot, but the port is down, for example, in that case. We can see the layer 2 MTU, we can see the speed, and we can see again who the alias, which is the port description as entered on the switch. Again, if we go back to switches and do a drop down on this, we have some database actions. These are much quicker because there's no live SNMP poll done here. So view edit ports shows us the database details for these ports. So you can see the type here is peering because we set those earlier on. They're a little bit out of order here, kind of being ordered by name rather than ID. We might that's probably something we should look at fixing. Port MAU detail shows us what the MAU, what optic, what SFP, SFP plus was in that port the last time the switch was polled by SNMP. This will only work for switches that support the MAU MIB, which is not all switches. But we can see that some of our ports have copper SFPs in there, so 1000 base T. Let's just order this by, so a lot of them are empty. We've got some LR optics, which are 10 gig single mode optics. We've got some 100 gig LR4, so 100 gig optics in there as well. Let's just see what else is in our drop down before we move on. Port report is just a static report of who, according to our customer or member list in the database, who's been assigned to a port. useful for just looking at when you're going through, when you're doing maintenance. Maybe print this off, bring it to the data center with you if you're trying to reorganize some patch leads and stuff like that. Unused optics will show us, based on the database, how many optics are unused. So where the switch supports the MAU MIB, so where we can detect what's in a switch port, and where that hasn't been allocated to a member. It will show us what types are there. So we've got like 1000 base T, 10 gig base LR. So this is great if you're trying to provision a port where you've pre-wired, or you might have pre-wired some ports and you're trying to avoid a trip to the data center, for example. See what optics are available, what might be pre-wired. And then the optic inventory gives you a rundown of the number of optics that you have in your switches of particular types. So again, useful just to get a quick inventory of what you have. So if we go back to our post install, we've added our switch now. So we've gone through steps 1 through 4. The next thing is adding our VLANs. And what we typically recommend is that you add 2 VLANs per infrastructure. One is your peering VLAN. It's where your members exchange traffic with each other. The second is a quarantine VLAN, where you would connect new members to do the provisioning process, to test bringing members online. We might do a video on the provisioning process that we follow at INEX at a later point. But it's a quarantine LAN, and it's also where you can move members into if they have issues and you want to do some diagnostics without potentially affecting any other members exchanging production traffic across your exchange. And we also say to add network information, so we'll have a look at that. We'll have a look at both of those things. So in IXP Manager, we have VLANs here. So no VLAN exists, it's expected. We've got some information here as well. We're going to add a VLAN now. So I'm going to give it a name. So we're going to give it INEX LAN 1, which is how we name the infrastructure, but it's also how we name the VLAN, the peering VLAN as well. The tag is the VLAN tag. Again, this is something that you would use for automated provisioning. So we're going to go with 10 here. The infrastructure this exists on is INEX LAN 1. The config name, again, this is down to provisioning stuff later, what you would name that VLAN in the switch configuration. So we've got 3 checkboxes we need to look at here. Again, if you're not sure about what's being required, click the help button and we get some context help. So is this a private VLAN between a subset of members? No, it's not. This is going to be the primary peering LAN for all of your members. Should we include the VLAN in the peering matrix? So at INEX, if I just pop over to INEX here for a second, we'll just go straight to IXP Manager. And under statistics, under peering, we have a peering matrix. Now, INEX LAN 1 is very busy. Let's take a look at INEX Court, for example, and we can see this is what we're talking about. So it looks like nearly everyone on INEX LAN 1 uses the root servers, very little bilateral peering going on. INEX LAN 2 should be easier to see and a little bit different. So all peerings, bilateral peering. All right, so we have an issue here. It looks like our database collector for discovering bilateral peering sessions isn't working, or at least we have a bug. So I'm going to take that offline and look at it. But again, root server peering. So kind of the idea of the peering matrix shows you who's peering with who at the exchange. And again, this is something we're going to look at later. You need to SLO to make this work. We're going to have a look at that in a different video. Sorry, so we do want to include the primary peering LAN in the peering matrix. And the peering manager is a tool that we have that allows members to request bilateral peerings from other members. And we do want this to be part of that because this is a primary peering LAN. So we're going to check both of those things and we're going to add that VLAN. So here we have it. Some drop-down context menus here about what we can do. View and edit as usual. What we want to do is we want to add some network information. And the network information is really so that our own provisioning tools and any members' provisioning tools will have enough information about the addressing on the VLAN to configure their interface. So for example, our VLAN is INEX LAN 1 for IPv4. So I'm going to use the documentation range of IP addresses here, and I'm going to do a /24. So I'm going to do a normal /24 peering LAN. I need to do the same for IPv6. So it's this VLAN, it's IPv6, it's the documentation prefix. I'm going to go with 2001:DB8:0:10 for my primary peering LAN, That's going to be a /64. And if we go back to the IXF member export now, we should see that for VLANs, we now have a VLAN, ID1. Again, that's an internal ID on the JSON document itself. So INXLAN1. For IPv4, the prefix is 192.0.20/24, and for IPv6, it's this /64. So we can see for people that are looking to do automated provisioning, they have the information they need besides their own IP address, which we would assign to them later, but they have the information they need to configure their interface in terms of the net mask or prefix. So that is our VLAN added. And the last thing that we need to do is add your peering IP addresses. So again, this is data fill. And when we're provisioning members later, as we'll see, adding IP addresses allows us to choose an unused IP address from a drop-down list of IP addresses. We can always add them manually into that, but that's a bit clunky, and it means that you need to remember especially your IPv6 peering LAN addresses, which is a little bit more difficult. So we add them in. We add them in advance, and that also allows us within the IP address to see what's being allocated and what's free as well at a glance. So for IPv4, for the VLAN I've just created, I want to add some IP addresses. So I can click the add button here, I can click the add some here. So this tool will actually add IP addresses based on prefix. So to give you an example, what I would normally do here is I would go and I would add the full /24. But just to give you an example, let's say that we added 8 addresses in the middle of that range. So I've got 8 to 15 here, which is a bit awkward and clunky, but it's just to give you an example of what this tool will do for you. So what I can do now is I can go and add again 192. Let's add the full 24 and skip over existing addresses without throwing an error. So it's quite a handy tool. It lets me fill up that entire range from 0 through to 255. So I've added the full range of addresses. Of course, that's a broadcast address that we would never really allocate in reality. So I'm going to remove that from the list. I'm also going to remove the network address from the list, just in case someone assigns it, but no one should. The network engineer should know not to assign those addresses, really. Same thing for V6. So for V6, obviously I don't want to add a /64. That would be billions and billions of addresses. So to prevent you accidentally populating your database with a ridiculous number of IP addresses, there is a lower subnet bound of /120. There's also, I think a /24 for IPv6. So /120 for IPv6. So I'm going to add /120. Now that again would be a huge amount. That would be a lot of IP addresses if I went below the 120. What I want to do is I want to enter decimal values only. And what that means, again, if I put on, so you're going to get a lot of help here, right? Decimal values means I'm not going to add any IPv6 addresses with A to F. Now, what I would advise you when you're adding IPv6 addresses is not to get carried away. Some exchanges have created really convoluted IPv6 addressing schemes that treats an IPv6 address almost like it's a database entry to provide information about a customer. For example, they might have ended the address :34:0:1:2, which means for their customer ID 34, this is the first, second, third address that they have in IPv6. Please don't treat your IPv6 addressing scheme like a database. What I would say is if you assign .34 for IPv4, just assign :34 for IPv6. I promise you, you won't regret it. Anything else you will regret. We have a very small number of odd addresses at INEX that we assigned in the early days before we went to this simple method. For example, our root collector on IPv4 is .126. On IPv6, it's :F:0:1. Why? Who knows? We wish it was just :126, but it's very hard to change that retrospectively. So I'm going to enter decimal values only. I'm also going to overflow the network band. What that means is if you're adding decimal addresses only, you would typically want the number of addresses created to match the size of the subnet. So I'm doing a /120, that's 256 addresses. I want to add 256 IPv6 addresses, skipping any non-decimal values. So I want to essentially enter the same range as I did for IPv4, 0 to 255 without any hex numbers. And that's what I'm doing here. So you can see now I've got up to 255. I'm at the end of my pagination. I'm going to get rid of that. Well, that's actually in IPv6. That's not a broadcast address, but it's not an IPv4 address that we're going to allocate. So I could delete it. Doesn't really matter. However, the 0 is a network address, so I do want to get rid of that. And you can see I've got the exact same v4, v6 addresses that end the same 250, 55 odd. That end with the same number at the end, the same decimal number at the end. That makes my addressing scheme really easy. If your IPv4 address ends in .20, your IPv6 address ends in :20. So that's all my IPv6 addresses added. What we would also do, sorry, I did say to you about 2 VLANs, about having a quarantine VLAN. Let me just add a quarantine VLAN here, just to show you what I meant here. So we had INX LAN 1, now we've got quarantine LAN 1. We're going to put that on VLAN tag 30. That is also on INX LAN 1, and the config name for that will be VL quarantine LAN 1. This isn't a private VLAN between a subset of members. It's a VLAN that we use for provisioning, so it's not something for between a private subnet of members. It's not a private VLAN. We don't want this to appear in a peering matrix. This is purely for diagnostic and provisioning purposes, and we don't want it to appear in the peering manager, so we don't tick those boxes at all. So we're going to add that VLAN. What we typically do with this VLAN is we give it the exact same addressing as a production LAN. So when we give our member an IP address for production, during the provisioning process, they configure that same address in quarantine. So they don't need to make any configuration changes once they've moved through the provisioning process. So for example, I come in here and let me just do the v4 side of it. For quarantine LAN 1, for IPv4, I would add the exact same address range. And again, for IP addresses, for quarantine LAN 1, I would add again that same batch of addresses. So when I allocate the member an IP address in quarantine, when I move them later to the production, they just have the same IP address. So I think that is everything on the initial steps. What we will cover in the next video will most likely be adding members for the first time. So how you add new members or customers, how you allocate them interfaces on your switch IP addresses. We might look at some stuff like IORDB entries and go through the process of fully adding a member, the information that we put in and why we want it. So I hope that was useful. Hopefully I'll get the next video done sometime next week, maybe, if not sooner. So thank you for your attention. Good evening, or good day, I should say.